Dylan never thought a grocery store could make him feel this out of place. Back where he came from, you picked what you needed, paid cash, and left. Simple. Here in Los Angeles, everything beeped, flashed, or expected you to know things nobody ever explained. Dylan stood in front of a self-checkout machine, staring at the screen like it had personally offended him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing worn jeans, boots, and a faded plaid shirt. The kind of man who looked like he belonged on a ranch, not under bright supermarket lights. He had just moved to the city a few days ago, leaving behind his quiet countryside life, and nothing here felt natural yet. He scanned one item. It beeped too loud. The screen told him to place it in the bagging area. He did. Then it yelled at him again. Something about unexpected weight. "I'll just put it where you told me," Dylan muttered under his breath, glancing around as if someone might come explain this nonsense. Nobody did. The line behind him started to grow. Someone sighed. Another person tapped their foot. The pressure built fast. Dylan tried again, pressed a random button, and suddenly the machine locked up completely. A red light blinked like an alarm. "Great," he exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Real smooth, Dylan." That was when someone stepped beside him. Calm. Steady. "Hey, it's okay. These things act up all the time." The voice was low, controlled, and confident. Dylan turned his head and saw him. The man was tall, fit, wearing a plain dark t-shirt that didn't hide the fact he was built like someone used to physical work. His hair was short, neat. His posture gave him away before anything else, disciplined, alert. This was Scott, a local police officer. He wasn't in full uniform, but the badge clipped at his belt and the way people instinctively gave him space made it obvious who he was. Scott reached over without crowding Dylan. "You scanned it twice. That's why it's yelling at you." He tapped a few buttons, cleared the error, then nodded toward the screen. "Try again. Slow this time." Dylan followed his lead. One item. Beep. Into the bag. No alarm. He let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "Appreciate it," Dylan said, voice a bit rough, still not fully comfortable being helped. Scott gave a small nod. "No problem. First time using one of these." Dylan huffed a quiet laugh. "That obvious?" Scott smiled just a little. A little. Before Dylan could say anything else, a German shepherd padded up and nudged his leg. Dylan looked down, surprised. The dog's tail wagged like it had already decided they were friends. "Hey there," Dylan said instinctively, crouching slightly and offering his hand. The dog licked his fingers without hesitation. Scott glanced down. "That's Daisy. She decides who's worth trusting faster than I do." Dylan scratched behind Daisy's ear, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time since he walked into the store. "Guess I passed then." "Looks like it," Scott replied. Dylan finished paying, this time without triggering a full system meltdown, and grabbed his bags. He hesitated for half a second, then added, "I just moved here. Still figuring things out." Scott leaned slightly against the counter, relaxed but attentive. "Yeah? Neighborhood around here's decent. Quiet for LA." Dylan nodded. "That's what I was hoping for." Scott glanced at him again, taking in the boots, the calloused hands, the way Dylan carried himself. "You from out of state?" Dylan shook his head. "Just far enough. Ranch work mostly." That seemed to click something for Scott. "That explains the hands," he said, not judgmental, just observant. There was a short pause, not awkward, just unfamiliar. Daisy sat between them like she was holding the conversation together. Scott checked his watch. "I've got to head out. But hey, welcome to the area." Dylan shifted his grip on the grocery bags. "Thanks. And thanks for the help back there." Scott gave him one more small, genuine smile. "Anytime." Daisy gave Dylan one last look before following Scott out, tail still wagging. Dylan walked out of the store a minute later, the city, noise hitting him again. Cars, distant sirens, people moving fast like they all had somewhere urgent to be. He loaded the groceries into his truck, one of the few things from home that still felt familiar, and sat there for a second before starting the engine. He didn't know why that short interaction stuck with him, but it did. Maybe because Scott didn't make him feel stupid. Maybe because Daisy acted like he belonged without asking questions. Or maybe because for the first time since arriving, someone looked at him, like he wasn't completely out of place. Later that evening, Dylan pulled into the driveway of his new place. Small house. Quiet street. Exactly what he needed, even if it didn't feel like home yet. He stepped out, grabbed the grocery bags, and headed toward the front door. That was when he heard it. A familiar bark. He turned his head. Next door in the yard, Scott stood holding Daisy's leash. Same steady posture, same controlled energy. The dog spotted Dylan immediately and tugged forward, clearly recognizing him. Scott followed her gaze, then looked up and saw Dylan standing there with his groceries. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. Then Scott lifted his chin slightly. "Hey!" Dylan shifted the bags in his hands and gave a small nod back. "Hey!" Daisy pulled harder this time, almost dragging Scott a step forward. Dylan couldn't help a faint smile. "She remembers me." Scott looked down at the dog, then back at Dylan. "She doesn't forget people she likes." Dylan adjusted his grip again, suddenly aware of how tired he was, how new everything still felt. But standing there, across that short stretch of space between two houses, it didn't feel quite as overwhelming. Not as heavy. "Guess that's a good sign," Dylan said. Scott nodded once. "Yeah, it is." Dylan turned back toward his door, but something in his chest had shifted just slightly. The city still didn't make sense. The noise, the systems, the pace, it was all too much. But now there was a neighbor, a cop named Scott, and a dog named Daisy who already decided he belonged. It wasn't much, but for Dylan, it was a start. The next few days passed in a rhythm Dylan was still trying to understand. He woke up early out of habit, even though the city didn't run on sunrise the way his old life did. He fixed small things around his new place, unpacked slowly, and tried not to feel like he had made a mistake coming here. The only part that felt steady was next door. Every morning around the same time, he'd hear Daisy barking, followed by Scott's calm voice giving commands. Dylan didn't go out to watch, but he noticed. It was hard not to. On the fourth day, the quiet routine broke. Dylan was in the middle of fixing a loose cabinet hinge in his kitchen when he heard a sharp metallic noise from outside, followed by water splashing. Then Daisy barked, louder than usual. Not playful this time. Alert. Dylan straightened immediately. That kind of sound, that tone from a dog, meant something was wrong. He stepped out the front door and glanced toward Scott's house. Scott stood just outside his front door, barefoot, wearing a dark t-shirt and sweatpants, water dripping from his hair and shoulders like he had just stepped out of the shower. Behind him, through the open door, water was clearly spraying across the bathroom floor. Daisy was pacing near the entrance, ears up, restless. Scott ran a hand through his wet hair, clearly irritated but trying to stay calm. That's when he spotted Dylan. For a second, there was hesitation, like he didn't want to ask for help. But then practicality won. "Hey, you got a second?" Dylan was already walking over. "What happened?" "Pipe under the shower snapped or something. I turned the main valve off, but it's still leaking inside." Scott stepped aside so Dylan could see. "I was going to call someone, but," he paused, then added, "You said you're good with this kind of thing." Dylan didn't answer right away. He just nodded once and stepped inside. The bathroom was a mess. Water pooled across the tiles, dripping steadily from the base of the wall near the shower. Dylan crouched down immediately, ignoring the water soaking into his jeans. He reached toward the pipe opening, checked the pressure, then glanced up. "You got tools?" Scott moved fast. "Yeah, garage." He disappeared and came back seconds later with a basic toolkit. Dylan took it, opened it on the floor, and got to work without wasting time. He tightened what he could, checked the connection, then shook his head slightly. The joint cracked. "Cheap material. Happens." Scott leaned against the door frame, arms crossed, watching closely. Not hovering, but focused. "Can it be fixed?" "Yeah. Just need to replace the connector." "You got a spare?" Scott shook his head. Dylan exhaled once. "I do. In my truck." He stood up, already moving. "Give me 5. Scott didn't stop him. "Appreciate it." Dylan was back fast, carrying a small box of parts. He didn't explain much. He just got down on one knee again, shut off the last bit of pressure, removed the damaged piece, and fitted a new one in. His hands moved with confidence, precise and efficient. This was his world. No confusion, No hesitation. Just problem and solution. Daisy wandered in halfway through and immediately came to sit beside Dylan. Watching him like this was the most important job in the world. Dylan reached over briefly and scratched her head without looking away from his work. "Good girl," he muttered. She wagged her tail and stayed close. Scott noticed that. The way Dylan moved. The way Daisy trusted him without a second thought. It was different from what he was used to. Most people he met were tense around him, especially once they realized he was a cop. Dylan wasn't. He was focused, grounded, useful. "All right," Dylan said after a few minutes. "Turn the valve back on." Scott pushed off the wall and did exactly that. The water pressure came back. Dylan watched the joint carefully. No leak. No drip. Solid. He gave a small nod. "You're good." Scott let out a breath, tension finally easing from his shoulders. "That fast?" "Yeah. Should hold fine now." Dylan wiped his hands on a cloth and stood up. His jeans were soaked, but he didn't seem to care. "If it starts leaking again, I'll redo the whole line." Scott stepped closer, glancing at the fixed pipe, then back at Dylan. There was a clear shift in his expression now. Not just polite appreciation. Real respect. "You just saved me a few $100 and a flooded house." Dylan shrugged lightly. "It's nothing." "It's not nothing." Scott shook his head slightly, then gave a small, genuine smile. "Let me at least say thanks properly." "Dinner. My place. Tonight." Dylan hesitated. Not because he didn't want to, because he wasn't used to this. To people offering things like that. But Daisy nudged his hand at that exact moment, like she had an opinion on the situation. Dylan huffed a quiet breath. "Yeah. Okay." Scott nodded once, satisfied. Seven. Dylan headed back to his house, but the feeling was different this time. He wasn't just a new guy anymore. He had stepped into something real. Done something that mattered. That evening, when Dylan walked back over, the door was already open. Scott stood inside, now dry, dressed in a simple dark shirt and jeans. The place looked lived in, not staged. Comfortable. Daisy rushed forward the second she saw Dylan, tail going wild. Dylan crouched automatically, letting her lean into him. "Hey girl." Scott watched that for a second, then gestured inside. "Come in." Dylan stepped in, taking in the space briefly, but not staring. He had already learned that this wasn't just a house. It was Scott's space. Personal. Dinner wasn't complicated. Grilled chicken, something quick on the side. They sat across from each other at a small table. At first, the conversation stayed simple. Work. The neighborhood. Where Dylan came from. Scott listened more than he talked, asking direct questions, not pushing. "You planning to stay?" Scott asked at one point. Dylan paused slightly before answering. "I don't know yet. Figured I'd try. See if I can make it work." Scott nodded slowly. "City's not easy if you're not used to it." "Yeah," Dylan said. "Not exactly built for it." Scott looked at him for a second longer than necessary, then said, "Doesn't mean you don't belong." The words landed heavier than they should have. Dylan didn't respond right away. He just nodded once and kept eating. Daisy moved between them during the meal, settling near Dylan's chair like she had already decided her spot. At one point, her head rested against Dylan's knee. He didn't move it away. By the time dinner ended, something had shifted again. Not dramatic, not obvious, but real. Dylan stood near the door, about to leave. "Thanks. For dinner." Scott leaned against the wall, relaxed. "Thanks for not letting my bathroom collapse." Dylan gave a faint smile. Then Daisy walked up again, sitting between them, looking from one to the other like she was making sure neither of them left too quickly. Scott exhaled softly. "She's gonna keep doing that, you know." Dylan glanced down at her, then back at Scott. "Yeah, I think she already decided something." Scott's gaze met his. "Yeah, I think so too." Dylan stepped out into the night, but this time, the city didn't feel quite as unfamiliar. Because now there was a door next to his. And for the first time since he arrived, it felt like it might actually open. The days after that dinner didn't go back to normal. They changed quietly but clearly. Dylan started stepping outside more often, not because he suddenly liked the city, but because there was something next door worth walking toward. Every morning, he'd hear Daisy first, then Scott giving calm, control commands. This time, Dylan didn't stay inside. He leaned against his fence, arms crossed, watching without trying to hide it. Scott noticed on the second morning. He didn't call out, just nodded once. "You're up early." "Always am," Dylan replied. "Habit." Scott gestured toward Daisy. "She needs the same routine. Keeps her sharp. She's still in training." That was the first time he said it clearly. Daisy wasn't just a pet. She was a working dog, being trained alongside him. Dylan stepped a little closer, resting his forearms on the fence. "Mind if I watch?" Scott shook his head. "Go ahead." It became a pattern after that. Dylan watched. Sometimes Scott explained things, basic commands, how Daisy responded to tone more than words. One morning, Scott handed Dylan a leash. "Try." Dylan hesitated for half a second, then took it. Daisy looked up at him, alert but calm. "Sit," Dylan said, a little unsure. Daisy didn't move. Scott spoke from behind him. "Lower your voice. Don't ask. Tell." Dylan adjusted, voice firmer. "Sit." Daisy dropped immediately. Dylan let out a quiet breath. "All right, I see it." Scott gave a small nod. "She reads confidence." That moment did something. It wasn't big, but it mattered. Dylan wasn't just watching anymore. He was part of it. Evenings started to shift too. Scott would be out back after work, sometimes running drills with Daisy, sometimes just sitting with a drink. Dylan found reasons to be outside at the same time. Fixing something that didn't need fixing. Cleaning tools twice. It didn't matter. The distance between the two houses slowly felt smaller. One night, Scott called over the fence. "You eat yet?" Dylan shook his head. "Not yet. Come over. I got extra." That became another routine. Not every night, but enough that it stopped feeling like an invitation and started feeling normal. They didn't always talk about anything important. Sometimes it was just food, silence, Daisy moving between them like she belonged to both sides. But things didn't stay simple. One evening, while they were sitting on Scott's back steps, Dylan noticed something different. Scott was quieter than usual. Not tired, closed off. His posture was tighter, his answers shorter. "You good?" Dylan asked. Scott didn't look at him right away. "Yeah, just work." Dylan didn't push, but he didn't ignore it either. "Bad day." Scott let out a breath through his nose. "Just complicated." He took a drink, then added, "Some people at the station don't like anything that doesn't fit clean lines." Dylan understood more than Scott said. He didn't have the same job, but he knew what it felt like to not fit. "You mean people like me?" Dylan said, not accusing, just stating. Scott finally looked at him. "No, I mean people like me." That was the first time it came close to being said out loud. The air shifted. Heavier. Real. Daisy moved closer, settling between them like she always did when things got tense. Dylan rested a hand on her back, grounding himself more than the dog. Scott leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Cops are supposed to be simple. Straight. No complications. He gave a quiet, almost bitter huff. "I'm not exactly built like that." Dylan didn't answer immediately. He chose his words carefully. "You don't seem like someone who pretends well." Scott gave a small, humorless smile. "I've been doing it for years." That sat between them. Later that same night, things almost changed. They were standing by the back fence, closer than usual. Daisy had wandered off toward the corner of the yard, distracted by something. For once, there was no buffer between them. Scott said something, Dylan didn't even fully catch it, but he stepped closer while saying it. Too close for normal conversation. Dylan didn't step back. For a second, neither of them moved. Scott's eyes dropped briefly to Dylan's mouth, then back up. It was small, but it was there. Clear. Dylan felt it. That pull. That moment where everything either happens or doesn't. He didn't move away. Scott did. Not abruptly. Not harsh. Just enough to break it. He straightened slightly, took half a step back, and cleared his throat. "I should check on Daisy." Just like that, it was gone. Dylan stayed where he was, jaw tightening slightly. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The message was clear enough. Things didn't go back to how they were after that. Scott didn't stop talking to him. Didn't avoid him completely. But there was a difference now. A line had appeared where there wasn't one before. Morning training still happened, but Scott didn't hand Dylan the leash anymore. Evenings still overlapped, but invitations were less frequent. When it did talk, it stayed safer. Surface level. Dylan noticed every bit of it. One afternoon, Dylan was working on his truck when Daisy suddenly showed up at his side, tail wagging like nothing had changed. Dylan crouched automatically, rubbing her head. "Hey girl, you escaping again?" A second later, Scott appeared at the edge of the driveway, hands in his pockets. "Sorry, she keeps coming over here." Dylan stood up slowly. "You don't sound like you're trying to stop her." Scott gave a small shrug. "She goes where she wants." Dylan looked at him for a second. "Wish people did that." Scott didn't answer. Silence stretched. Not comfortable this time. Dylan broke it. "Did I do something?" "No." That didn't look like a no. Scott looked away briefly, then back. "It's not about you." "Feels like it is." Scott exhaled, clearly not want to have this conversation out here. "I just need to keep things simple." Dylan let out a quiet, sharp breath. "Yeah, you said that before." Scott nodded once. "And I meant it." That hit harder than Dylan expected. He didn't argue. Didn't push further. He just nodded once, the same way Scott always did. "Got it." Daisy looked between them, sensing the shift, her tail slowing. Dylan stepped back toward his truck. "You should take her before she decides she lives here now." Scott called Daisy, and she hesitated for a second before going to him. That hesitation didn't go unnoticed. Scott clipped the leash back on, but he didn't say anything else before walking away. Dylan stood there for a while after, staring at nothing in particular. The city still didn't feel like home. And now, for the first time since he got here, neither did next door. The distance didn't happen all at once. It settled in slowly, like something neither of them wanted to admit, but both felt every day. Dylan stopped going out in the mornings to watch training. Scott still came out with Daisy at the same time, still gave the same commands, but now there was no one leaning on the fence, no quiet presence watching. Evenings got quieter too. No more casual dinners, no more "you eat yet," drifting over the yard. Just two houses, side by side, pretending nothing had changed. But something had. Dylan kept busy. He fixed everything he could find, loose boards, squeaky hinges, things that didn't even need fixing. It was easier than thinking. Easier than replaying that moment by the fence. Easier than wondering why Scott stepped back. Scott wasn't doing much better. At work, he was sharper than usual. Too sharp. Short with people, quicker to shut conversations down. His partner, a guy named Ramirez, another officer who had worked with Scott for years, noticed it right away. Ramirez wasn't the kind of guy who let things slide. "You're off," he said one afternoon in the patrol car. "You either talk, or you keep snapping at everyone. Pick one." Scott didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the road. Ramirez shook his head. "Yeah, that's what I thought." That same night, things finally broke. Dylan was in his backyard, working on a section of old fencing that separated the two properties. It didn't really need fixing. It just gave him something to do. The sun had already gone down, but he kept going under the porch light, tools scattered around his feet. Then Daisy showed up again. No leash. No hesitation. She pushed through the half-open gap in the fence and walked straight to Dylan, tail wagging like nothing had changed between the humans involved. Dylan froze for a second, then sighed and crouched down. "You're making this harder. You know that?" He rubbed her head anyway. She leaned into him like she always did. A second later, Scott's voice came from the other side. "Daisy." The dog didn't move. Scott stepped into view, stopping just a few feet away on his side of the fence. He looked tired. Not physically, something deeper. His eyes flicked from Daisy to Dylan, then stayed there. "Sorry," Scott said. "She keeps getting out." Dylan stood up slowly. "You keep saying that." Scott didn't respond right away. He stepped closer, close enough that the fence between them didn't feel like much of a barrier. "I've been busy." Dylan let out a short breath. "Yeah, I noticed." Silence hit again, heavier this time. No easy way around it anymore. Scott rested one hand on the top of the fence, fingers tightening slightly against the wood. "Look, I didn't mean to." "Don't," Dylan cut in. Not loud, but firm. "Don't start that sentence unless you're going to finish it." Scott's jaw tightened. "I'm trying to keep things from getting complicated." Dylan let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Too late for that." Scott looked away briefly, then back. "You don't understand how this works for me." "Then explain it," Dylan shot back immediately. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you got close, then decided I wasn't worth the risk. That landed. Scott straightened slightly. That's not what this is. Then what is it? Dylan stepped closer to, the space between them shrinking. Because I'm not guessing anymore. Scott ran a hand over his face, frustrated. My job isn't just a job. It's my whole life. The people I work with, the reputation, the expectations. If I cross certain lines, it's not just awkward. It's everything. Dylan didn't back down. So I'm a line? Scott didn't answer immediately. That was answer enough. Dylan nodded slowly, the realization settling in. Got it. Scott's voice dropped. That's not fair. Dylan shook his head. No, what's not fair is you acting like this is simple. Like you can just turn it off when it gets uncomfortable. He pointed slightly between them. You stepped into this too. Don't act like I dragged you here. Scott's control cracked a little. I know that. Do you? Dylan pressed. Because it feels like you'd rather pretend it didn't happen. Scott's voice rose slightly. I'm trying to protect what I have. And what about me? Dylan shot back instantly. You protecting anything there? That hit harder than anything before. For a second, Scott had no answer. Daisy moved between them, pacing now, clearly unsettled by the tone. She looked from one to the other, whining softly. Scott finally spoke, quieter but strained. I don't know how to do both. Dylan's expression didn't soften. Then maybe you should figure that out before pulling someone into it. The words hung heavy in the air. Scott stepped back slightly, like the distance might give him control again. I didn't mean to hurt you. Dylan shook his head once. Yeah, you did anyway. That was the breaking point. Neither of them spoke for a few seconds. Just breathing, tension thick enough to feel. Then Dylan stepped back fully, creating real distance this time. I'm done standing here, waiting for you to decide if I'm worth it. Scott's voice dropped. Dylan. No, Dylan cut him off again, sharper now. You want simple? You got it. We're neighbors. That's it. Daisy whined louder, moving toward Dylan, but Scott called her back. She hesitated, right there in the middle, torn between both sides. That moment said everything. Scott clipped the leash onto her collar, his movements slower than usual. Come on, Daisy. She went with him, but she kept looking back. Dylan turned away first this time, walked back toward his house without another word, tools still lying where he left them. Scott stayed by the fence for a few seconds after, staring at the empty space Dylan had just filled. His grip on the leash tightened slightly. Later that night, Scott sat alone on his back steps, the same place they had shared dinners before. Daisy lay at his feet, quieter than usual. His phone sat in his hand, screen lit, but he didn't type anything. Ramirez's words echoed in his head. You either talk, or you keep snapping at everyone. Scott exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. For the first time, it wasn't about the job. Not really. It was about fear. About what it would cost to stop pretending. Across the fence, Dylan's house stayed dark longer than usual. Inside, Dylan sat on the edge of his bed, staring at nothing. The anger had burned off, leaving something heavier behind. Not regret. Not exactly. Just the realization that leaving had been easier than staying and hoping. Neither of them slept much that night. And for the first time since they met, the space between their two houses felt like more than just a fence. It felt like a line they might not be able to cross again. The silence didn't break the next day, or the day after. It stretched out, steady and uncomfortable, like both of them were waiting for the other to move first, and neither one was willing to risk it. Dylan kept to his side. He worked on his truck, fixed things around the house, left early sometimes just to avoid being there when Scott was outside. Scott kept his routine too. Morning training with Daisy. Late shifts. Quiet nights. From the outside, nothing looked different, but the space between them had changed completely. Daisy didn't understand any of it. On the third day after the argument, she slipped out again. This time it wasn't an accident. Scott had unclipped her leash in the yard, and she just walked straight through the gap in the fence without even pretending to hesitate. Scott watched her go. He didn't call her back right away. He just stood there, hands on his hips, like he already knew where she was heading. Dylan was in his backyard, sitting on an overturned crate, working on a broken latch. He heard the soft thud of paws on dirt before he saw her. Daisy walked right up and sat in front of him, looking up like nothing had ever gone wrong. Dylan stared at her for a second, then let out a slow breath. "You don't give up, huh?" He reached down and scratched behind her ear. She leaned into it immediately. A few seconds later, Scott appeared at the fence. He didn't rush this time. He walked over and stopped on his side, watching quietly. For once, he didn't start with an apology. He didn't call Daisy either. Dylan noticed him, but he didn't stand up. He stayed where he was, one hand resting on Daisy's back. "She's persistent." Scott nodded slightly. "Yeah, she is." Another pause. Not as sharp as before, but still careful. Scott spoke first this time, voice steady but lower than usual. "I've been thinking." Dylan gave a small, almost tired huff. That usually ends well. Scott didn't react to the tone. "I handled that wrong." Dylan looked up at him then. Really looked. Scott wasn't defensive. He wasn't shutting down. This was different. "Yeah," Dylan said simply. "You did." Scott took that without pushing back. "I thought if I kept things controlled, simple, I could avoid messing anything up." He paused briefly, then added, "But I already did." Dylan didn't respond right away. He watched him, waiting to see if there was more. There was. Scott stepped closer to the fence, resting his hands on the top rail. "I'm good at my job because I follow rules. I know where the lines are, and I don't cross them." He let out a quiet breath. "But this doesn't fit into that." Dylan stood up slowly now, Daisy staying between them, but looking up at both. "So what? That means you walk away." Scott shook his head. "No, that's what I thought at first." He met Dylan's eyes directly. "But that's not what I want." That landed differently. Dylan crossed his arms, still guarded. Wanting something and doing something about it aren't the same. "I know," Scott said. "That's why I'm here." Dylan glanced at the fence between them. "You're still on your side." Scott didn't hesitate this time. He reached down, unlatched the loose section Dylan had been fixing, and pushed it open just enough to step through. It wasn't dramatic. It was simple, direct, but it mattered. Now they were standing on the same side. Daisy immediately shifted closer to both of them, tail picking up again. Scott continued, voice steady but honest. "I can't promise this is going to be easy. My job doesn't change. The people around me don't change overnight." He paused, then added, "But I don't want to keep pretending like you're something I can just ignore when it gets complicated." Dylan studied him carefully. "And when it does get complicated?" Scott didn't look away. "Then I deal with it, not run from it." Dylan let that sit for a second. "You already ran once." Scott nodded. "Yeah, and I'm not doing that again." Silence again. But this time it wasn't empty. It was decision. Dylan finally spoke, quieter but still firm. "I'm not going to stand around hoping you figure out later. I'm not built for that." "I know," Scott said. "That's why I'm not asking you to wait." He took a small step closer. "I'm asking you to give me a chance to do it right this time." Dylan's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, just thinking. "And what does right look like to you?" Scott didn't overcomplicate it. Honest. No hiding. No pretending this is nothing. That was what Dylan needed to hear. He exhaled slowly, some of the tension finally easing out of his shoulders. "You're not good at this, you know that." Scott let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Yeah, I'm figuring that out." Dylan shook his head slightly, but there was no edge to it now. "You're going to mess it up again at some point." "Probably," Scott admitted. "But I'll fix it." Dylan glanced down at the half-repaired fence, then back at him. "You better." Scott followed his gaze. "Speaking of fixing things." Dylan huffed a small breath. "Yeah, that's not done." Without another word, Dylan bent down and grabbed his tools. Scott moved with him, no hesitation this time. They worked side by side, close but not rushed. No awkward distance, no forced conversation. Just the sound of tools wood shifting, something broken being put back together. Daisy moved between them, occasionally getting in the way, occasionally just sitting and watching like she had been waiting for this exact moment. At one point, their hands brushed reaching for the same tool. Neither of them pulled away immediately this time. Dylan glanced at him. "You're still going to have to deal with your world." Scott nodded. "I will. And I'm not changing who I am to fit into it. I don't want you to." That answer came too fast to be fake. Dylan held his gaze for a second longer, then went back to work. By the time the fence was done, the gap was gone. Not sealed off, just reinforced, stable with a proper latch that could open easily from either side. Scott stood up, brushing his hands off. That works. Dylan tested the latch once. Smooth. Solid. Yeah, it does. Daisy immediately pushed it open with her nose and walked through to Scott's yard, then turned and walked right back again like she was proving a point. Dylan shook his head, a real smile finally breaking through. She's not even subtle. Scott watched her, then looked back at Dylan. She didn't want to separate it in the first place. Smart dog, Dylan said. The sun had dropped lower now, the lights softer, the tension gone. Scott leaned lightly against the fence, closer than before. You want to eat? Dylan glanced at him. You cooking? Scott gave a small nod. Yeah. Dylan considered it for about half a second. All right. They moved toward Scott's place together this time. No invitation needed. No hesitation. Inside, things felt different from before. Not new, just clearer. Dinner was simple again, nothing fancy. But the conversation wasn't avoiding anything now. They talked about real things. About work. About what Scott was dealing with. About where Dylan came from and what he left behind. At one point, Scott said quietly, "You don't feel out of place to me." Dylan looked at him. "City still does." Scott nodded. "That'll take time." Dylan leaned back slightly, thinking, "Yeah, but it's not as bad as it was." Scott didn't ask why. He already knew. Later that night, they ended up back outside, sitting on the steps with Daisy stretched out between them. No tension, no pretending. Dylan rested his arms on his knees, looking out at the quiet street. "You know, I wasn't sure this place was going to work." Scott glanced at him. "And now?" Dylan didn't answer right away. He just looked over, meeting Scott's eyes. "Now I think it might." Scott held that look steady. "Good." There was a moment. Not rushed. Not uncertain. Scott leaned in first this time. Dylan didn't hesitate. The kiss wasn't complicated. It was clear. Grounded. No pulling back. No second-guessing. When they separated, it didn't move far. Daisy shifted, settling closer against both of them like she had been waiting for this exact outcome. Dylan exhaled quietly, something in his chest finally settling. Guess she was right. Scott glanced down at the dog, then back at Dylan. Yeah. The city was still loud. Still fast. Still not built for someone like Dylan. But sitting there, right next to Scott, with Daisy at their feet, and the fence no longer a barrier but a doorway, it didn't feel like something he had to fight anymore. For the first time since he arrived, it felt like he had a place in it. Not because the city changed, but because he found someone in it who made him want to stay. And that's where their story truly begins. Not perfect, not easy, but real. Two people from different worlds, choosing each other anyway. Sometimes, home isn't a place you find, but a person you stay for. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and support the channel. See you in the next story.